Aranvir Singh from Belfast Healthy Cities to present on Greening the City programme and the findings of an evidence review and discussions with stakeholders. Aaron is a programme officer in Belfast Healthy Cities. He's leading the development of Greening the City programme and supports the Healthy Transport and Community Prosperity programmes. Aaron is also a trustee of the Town and Country Planning Association, non-executive director of public practice and advisor to the Women in Planning Network. So thank you, Aaron, if you'd like to take forward your presentation.
Hi everyone, and Carol, thank you for the introduction. As Carol mentioned, I've been leading the development of the Green the City programme here at Belfast Healthy Cities. Next slide, please. Today, I'll be sharing some background to the programme. I'll provide some further details on the approach that we have been taking to develop this area of work. I'll share some of the key findings of this scoping exercise, and I'll also set out some of the next steps, including how attendees can get involved in supporting the programme moving forward. So to give you all some background to the Green the City programme, it has an overall goal to create mutually beneficial relationships between citizens and the urban environment for improved physical and mental well-being. This is underpinned by 4 objectives, and these are to promote inclusive green environments for all, with a focus on increasing physical activity and mental well-being to reduce the risk of long-term disease. To encourage the greening of public spaces to really promote those wider benefits to health and well-being, such as by helping to mitigate and manage the consequences of climate change and support biodiversity or address air pollution. To really focus on increasing stakeholder collaboration and community engagement in the design of green and blue spaces. And then objective 4, which is also overarching for the programme, is really about promoting interventions that reduce health inequalities. Next slide, please. So in terms of the approach that we've taken to develop the programme, it really began with our application to the phase 7 of the WHO Healthy City Network and a situational analysis that formed part of that. And so we had a range of conversations with stakeholders across Belfast, exploring the themes of people, place, planet, prosperity, participation, and peace. And an emerging theme and an area for priority to address was greening the city. And so we really realized that priority in our strategic plan, which includes the goal and objectives outlined on the previous slide. Towards the middle and end of last year, we also undertook a scoping exercise. And this really began with a literature review of the evidence published by the WHO, supported by some evidence from developed in Northern Ireland, alongside looking at local and regional policies and strategies, really trying to understand what greening the city means and its connections to health, well-being, and inequalities. Alongside this, we also undertook a range of discussions with stakeholders, many of whom are attending the webinar today. And we published the findings of the evidence review and stakeholder discussions on our website. We are now in the process of developing an action plan and a working group to really focus on the delivery of the Green the City programme. And the webinar today and the discussion that we'll all be having will very much inform our next steps. Next slide, please. So the WHO sets out that green spaces are a necessary feature of a healthy place, and that the benefits of this infrastructure can be maximised through adequate planning, design, and evaluation. And so the WHO have set out this iterative cycle for green space action, and it really begins with involving communities, engaging communities to assess the need for green and blue spaces in their area, and then providing and maintaining these spaces, as well as promoting their use, and then reviewing the effectiveness of these interventions in terms of their benefits to health, well-being, and social equity. Next slide, please. And so in terms of what green the city means, the WHO highlight that the definition very much depends on context. And then there is a tendency to focus on urban green spaces, typically for public recreational use. But what we find is that green the city very much encompasses all green and blue spaces and features in Belfast. And this includes more rural parts, such as Belfast Hills, water bodies, such as the river and the harbour, active travel corridors, such as greenways, civic spaces, such as C.S. Lewis Square, as well as green and blue features, such as street trees. And what was really apparent in the stakeholder conversations was that the interpretation was very much based on the different spheres of influence that stakeholders have, alongside some of the local environmental features or challenges that are unique to Belfast. And so, for example, what we found was that those working closely on environmental protection and advocacy tended to draw out the multifunctional benefits of greening. And so we'd find terms like green and blue infrastructure, nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, and soft interventions. In contrast, those working within the health sector really focused on the use of these spaces and really promoting uses such as walking, cycling, jogging, or social connections. And those working closely with communities drew out a particular emphasis on the connections to health inequalities, for example, addressing social isolation. And so all in all, what we recognized from the stakeholder discussions was that when we talk about greening the city, there are different interpretations of what this means, and that there is a need to facilitate a common language moving forward. Next slide, please. Of course, all of us recognize the provision and use of green and blue spaces is important for health and well-being. And in particular, I've just highlighted some of the key benefits that the WHO recognize are supported by the evidence. And these very much include improved mental health, reduced stress, reduced prevalence of people with cardiovascular related diseases or type 2 diabetes, and that a recognition that the biggest benefits to people in terms of improving physical and mental well-being are seen when they use these spaces. There's also a recognition from the WHO that nature provides the basic conditions for and helps protect human health, and that when we put pressure on nature and the natural environment, that this can threaten the health of people and places. Next slide, please. The WHO also highlight that some of the key links between greening, health, and inequalities, which are supported by evidence, and that this is supported by further evidence developed by the Outdoor Recreation Northern Ireland. And so what we find, for example, is that the quantity, access, and use of green spaces are not uniform, and they very much linked to health inequalities. What we find is that these spaces tend to be distributed unfairly, that marginalized groups such as refugees, older people, or those with limited ability, or women, tend to use green and blue spaces less, and that the exposure to environmental risks such as air pollution or climate change tend to be greater for marginalized groups. Next slide, please. And so from the stakeholder discussions, some of the emerging challenges and opportunities really focused on partnership working, developing and sharing evidence and best practice, and then supporting community inclusion and engagement. In particular, I think from all stakeholders, there was a clear recognition that there's lots of work happening in relation to the Greening the City agenda, but there's a need to bring different disciplines and sectors together, and particularly over the whole life cycle of Green the City projects, which can last up to 30 years, and a real focus on trying to maintain those relationships from different scales of projects, at different stages of the projects, and across the long term, and really trying to work together to find those win-win scenarios. Stakeholders also highlighted, again, the development and sharing of evidence and best practice. Some of the gaps were linked to the mapping of green and blue spaces on both the community or neighborhood level and across the city. But also trying to find evidence to support an understanding of the quality of green and blue spaces, who uses them, the types of uses that they help support, as well as quantifying and monitoring the benefits to health, well-being, and the natural environment. And then the third real area for opportunity was really focused on enabling all individuals and communities to shape and use green and blue spaces and features. And so some suggestions involve building the capacity of communities to address emerging issues like biodiversity or flood risk, supporting communities to assess and better understand their local green and blue spaces, and really supporting smaller scale interventions on the household and community scale, such as those that help improve nature, social connection or physical activity in the local area. Next slide, please. So in terms of our next steps, we would like to develop an action plan and form a cross-sector working group to support the delivery of the programme over the next few years. And this will be informed by the presentations that we have from speakers today and the discussions that you'll be having in the breakout rooms. And we'd like to continue to extend the invite to work with partners to identify and support projects, programs that are addressing greening, health and inequalities in Belfast. So if you'd like to be involved, please send me an email, and my address is on the bottom of the screen here, aranvir@belfasthealthycities.com. And you can also find the documents that we published, including an evidence base, the evidence at a glance, and the stakeholder discussions on the Belfast Healthy Cities website.
Thank you, Aaron. Very interesting presentation there, and we can already see the connection between that and the following speakers. If you have any questions for Aaron, as part of the Q&A, can you please submit to the chat box, and we'd really encourage that to make the breakout session successful. So thank you, Aaron. I would now like to invite Mark Whittaker, a Senior Planning Officer from Belfast City Council, discuss greening and health in Belfast. Mark is a Senior Planning Officer in Belfast City Council, and he works in the local development plan team. He leads the environment community team in the development plans and policy section, and is responsible for environmental policy development for the draft plan strategy and the forthcoming local policies plan. Mark has more than 30 years as a professional planner. He's worked in forward planning in 2 central Scottish councils, and then as an executive planner for development management in Galway City. He also spent over 12 years in the private sector during the Tiger years, and led a planning team in a busy environmental consultancy. He returned home to Belfast in 2016 and joined the development plan team. So thank you, Mark, if you'd like to start your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Carol, for the introduction. Yes, my name is Mark Whittaker. I'm a senior planner with City Council. As Carol said, I'm working in the local development plan policy team, working on the new local development plan with a particular responsibility for environmental issues, which does include, in my case, community and health issues as well. So today, I'm going to continue the conversation I think Aaron has just started. I'm probably going to totally corroborate what Aaron said about different stakeholders having different perspectives. I am a planner, so I am talking from a planning perspective. I suppose that's inevitable, really. But today I'll touch upon the foundations of planning, some of the challenges facing our cities today, maybe a hopeful shift in the approach to the design, and then more specifically about the Belfast Local Development Plan and about our own green and blue infrastructure plan. And I know Aaron has mentioned a number of green and blue infrastructure issues, so without too much duplication, but hopefully you will see that there are connections probably throughout all of the presentations, and I suppose you would expect that there should be. So just firstly, just to think about public health and thinking about the health environment. I mean, the whole basis of the modern planning system was based on public health and disease control and well-being. Back to Ebenezer Howard's Green Cities movement, and at the time, when you had many Victorian industrialists realizing that there's a clear link between a healthy place, healthy living, and I suppose better productivity. So public health has long been a part of the planning system in the early days, and it continues to be. So I think even in the last 2 years with our reactions to the COVID-19 situation, I think it's fair to say, anecdotally at least, that our love and our enjoyment and our need for green space has been validated, and I think everybody would agree that the last 2 years we really have, where we can, we have taken value from from our gardens, from our public parks, from our coasts, etc. And I suppose that reinforces the link that the human being has with its green environment, and that the green environment itself helps to sustain life. Other than public health, there are other issues that have emerged, I suppose, more recently since the Garden City movement and the early days of planning, and they've largely been brought about primarily by the internal combustion engine, which is unfortunately for a number of decades has overtaken our thinking in many ways and has become the main element of our design process. The World Health Organization suggests that poor air quality is probably the greatest health threat to human health. Indeed, in the UK alone, about 40,000 deaths every year can be attributed to poor air quality. There's a cost there to society of over 20 billion, but clearly there's an individual and personal tragic costs there as well. Now this diagram just shows, by way of example, the 4 air quality management areas in Belfast. These are areas where pollution is particularly poor. And as you can see from the map, hopefully they're largely along the most heavily trafficked routes in the city, being the M1 and the West Link, the New Norwich Road and parts of the Outer Ring, the Armour Road and Cromwell Street and East Bridge Street. These are areas where, primarily due because of the heavy levels of traffic, air quality is particularly poor. But of course, there are pockets throughout the city where air quality is poor. I have to admit, it doesn't just come from traffic congestion; it comes from other sources as well. But traffic is a clear and key issue for air quality and for public health. And Belfast itself being the focus of jobs and employment in the region, the daily commute of vehicles that comes into the city, it's actually far too easy, in my opinion, for the private car to come into the city, find cheap parking every day. I admit things have changed in the last 2 years, but we are getting back to that scenario once again. The other big issue, of course, is climate change, and climate change is very complex. It requires a whole new systemic change, a systemic approach to our, how we live and live on the planet globally. I suppose if we look at Belfast as a city in itself, climate change in the city, we are, a low-lying city. Clearly, there's issues there with rising sea levels. There's issues with stormwater. We're in a basin surrounded by hills in a river valley, so flood risk is clearly a major issue for Belfast. And the amount of hard surfacing in Belfast means that any heavy rainfall can very quickly lead to flooding and can lead to out of sewer flooding, which for everybody understands isn't too pleasant. There are other issues, of course, with climate change, increased storms, heat waves, cold snaps, and this was quite importantly the loss of biodiversity. These are interconnected. They all have an impact either directly or indirectly on public health. And hopefully the rest of the presentation will try and look at those in a little more detail. As I maybe alluded to before, the car and the internal combustion engine became king for many, many decades. And some of the traditional solutions in cities has been engineering based. Like here, this photograph is a mock-up photograph. Obviously, it never came to pass. Shows the lower Ormo area with the proposed Belfast motorway system imposed on it along the riverside there. Would have led to, as you can see, an elevated motorway along the riverside with a major motorway junction crossing the Lagan. That was part of a larger scheme, which wasn't unique to Belfast, but in terms of Belfast, that included the West Link and the Lagan Bridge, which were built, of course. And I suppose today, whilst we all use the West Link and the M3 bridge, and it's a part of the infrastructure now, we can clearly see some of the implications and the what's been left behind because of those major infrastructure interventions. I think traditionally as well, so this, just to clarify, this is a big pipe, and simple as that. I think traditionally, engineering again would be, we can solve any issue through engineering processes. We can build bigger pipes, we can build more pipes, and that is true. And we have to admit, engineering solutions are always, or will always remain part of the overall solution. This pipe, I suppose, was meant to replicate or represent the the Belfast Big Dig back in the, I think it was finished in 2010, and which was a major upgrade and repair to a lot of the sewer network across Belfast, including a 6-mile long brand new storm sewer. So these traditional solutions very heavily engineering based, but there is, and I say they do form part of a solution. But I think in maybe more recent years there has maybe been a shift away to how we design our cities, and maybe a shift towards people-based and place-based and nature-based solutions. I think that is the key. I know Aaron has already made those, referred to some of those terms. I think maybe in some ways the reign of the private car is maybe beginning to reduce, and I think there is a shift, or maybe it's a realization or a remembering of the foundation of planning and public health and well-being be one of the key foundations of that. I've worked for over 30 years in various jurisdictions, and I have seen a change, albeit it is a very slow change, and there's a lot of resistance to it. There's a lot of talking, to be fair, around it, and there has been for some time. But I think we maybe are beginning to see more fundamental change in the way we plan and think about planning, and our desired outcomes as well. So I think, yeah, generally speaking, we're maybe shifting away from just keep building out a more and more suburban sprawl to a focus on making our cities better and building the right development in the right location. So this brings me on to the local development plan. You've maybe seen some of these slides before. Hopefully you are aware that all councils are preparing their new local development plan. So we are actually ahead of the other councils at the minute. We are the first council to get through the public inquiry. We are expecting our plan. Well, we have been told that the plan is sound, subject to some modifications. We're going through that process now, and we're hoping to have the plan strategy in place in the autumn. So it's a good start. It's a new start for Belfast. It's a chance to, I suppose, focus on what we feel is important to the city. As I say, I'm a planner, so that's what I'm talking about today. But I suppose I have to acknowledge that the City Council, as a body, has a range of departments and sections that deal with health and well-being in terms of projects and other things as well. But as I say, I'm really talking about planning today. The overall strategy for the plan is sustainable growth, inclusive growth, keeping the city compact, maximizing densities at the best locations, improving accessibility for all, promoting green travel, active travel, and creating neighborhoods and maybe more livable neighborhoods as well. So we're quite proud and quite focused on regenerating the city from the inside out, basically looking at our old brownfield sites, looking at those, maximizing densities and improving what we already have. We're not starting from a clean sheet, of course, like most cities. There's a legacy of issues to deal with, but we are hoping to address these through planning policy where planning can make a difference. In terms of our policy approach, some of the key policies that might be of relevance today would be protection of open space, improvement of open space, improved accessibility, green travel and active travel. Maybe wider issues would be around housing to meet societal needs, whether it be for affordable housing or special needs housing, etc. And again, a focus on good quality urban design and placemaking. If you look at open space, just as an example, we did do an audit of open space as part of the open spaces strategy for the city. And we are actually fairly well endowed with open space generally in terms of quantum, and probably our quality of open space is favourably comparable with other cities. We do have the Belfast Hills, the Lycan Valley Regional Park. We have a large number of public parks and recreation facilities throughout the city. I have to, it may not be all in the right locations, and there will be pockets of of neighbourhoods where open space accessibility may be poorer, and there may be certain sections of society, of course, who maybe don't have the same opportunity. So in many ways, it's maybe sometimes it's less about the quantum of open space, but it's the quality and accessibility and how it's used. And maybe that's, maybe that's a wee bit more of joined up thinking that is required for planners with other stakeholder groups. We do, and Aaron mentioned green and blue infrastructure. It's a bit of a mouthful, I'm afraid, but the green and blue infrastructure plan was adopted by the council in 2020. This is separate from the local development plan. It's actually not a planning policy document. It's a corporate document in this case. So it is more wide ranging. It does, it does influence council decision making on a day-to-day basis, whether that's operational decisions, investment decisions, capital projects, etc. It does try to make the best use of what we have, and clearly has links to resilience and well-being and public health, of course. It's based on 5 key principles, biodiversity being at the top. The reason biodiversity is at the top because it is so much interlinked with everything else, and there is a virtuous circle there. If we protect and improve biodiversity, human health is improved, in this virtual circle. If we allow our biodiversity to decline, there's a vicious circle, so it's the opposite. But clearly we need to invest, we need to plan and invest in our green networks across the city. We need to build them into all of our new development, including things like public realm and new projects and new buildings. They need to be looked after because they only function if they're well looked after.
Sorry, Mark.
I'm just drawing to a close now, thanks. And of course, money, of course, is very important, as is always the case. And the benefits there, I've just listed a few, but climate resilience and health and well-being, of course, are key to some of the benefits there. I have gone to the last slide, not too bad, but just really to sum up, I think simply put, we are recognising as planners and planning profession, to remember there is a clear link and a clear responsibility for planning and well-being, and hopefully through greening the city and making better use of what we already have, that we're on the correct trajectory. So thank you, Carol. Sorry I'm slightly over there, but okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. Really interesting presentation, and we can already see the layers and the links between Aaron's presentation and now Mark's, and also bringing us back to first base, Mark, in terms of relationship between public health and planning and the importance of it in policies going forward. So thank you again, and if I'll ask you to please put your questions into the chat box, so we can have a good panel at the end of this session. So thanks again, Mark. I would now like to invite Denise Cahill to join us. Denise is Healthy Cities Coordinator for Cork City. You're very welcome, Denise. She's going to present on supporting joined up action for greening and health. Denise has also kindly agreed to highlight some of her work to empower communities to shape green and blue spaces, as we had a change in the agenda at the last minute. In terms of Denise's biography, she's the Healthy Cities Coordinator for Cork City and adjunct lecturer in the School of Public Health and University of Cork. She has knowledge and experience and understanding of health promotion, well-being, and a commitment to social determinants of health and the reduction of health inequalities. She has over 20 years of experience in the public health and health promotion in the health service in Ireland, and a variety of roles in public health research and information. She has a strong and productive commitment to interagency collaboration to promote public health, and a presence as a key role in a variety of health-related Cork City-based interagency projects and partnerships, which will be very useful as a learning curve for us. Denise is a strong personal and professional interest and commitment to climate justice and environmental sustainability. So thank you, Denise, and if you take forward your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I'm delighted to join you, and I'm sorry I'm only joining at this stage. I had another commitment this morning, so I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, Aranvir and Anne, for the invitation. I'm going to talk a little bit. I've been asked to give an overview of some of the work that we've done in Cork, but also to offer my reflections on maybe lessons learned, and also maybe how Belfast can take some of our learning forward. So once again, thanks for this opportunity. So Cork is a designated WHO, World Health Organization healthy city, the same as Belfast, but we're not as long involved as Belfast has been. We've been designated for the past 10 years. Just to put a context on the work as to why we are working in this sphere of greening and health, the Lancet Commission reported that there was 3 areas that really need focus, and that's the whole area of conceptual and empathy failures in terms of climate action, knowledge failures, and implementation failures. And I suppose where I feel we fall in this is the implementation gap that is out there, that we have an opportunity to fill that gap and to implement some of the actions. So some of the work that we're doing, just trying to move on my slides, is in the urban space, obviously as a healthy city. So the urban actions that are suggested by the Lancet, because of the growth of urban populations, there is a greater emphasis on the importance of policies to improve health and the urban environment. So there are co-benefits between health and environmental sustainability. And one of those 4 key areas that the evidence is guiding us towards is the provision of green space. So the research is very strongly there. Our mandate within Healthy Cities and from the Lancet is very strongly saying we should be providing green spaces. And I think there's more and more evidence growing in this sphere. So Cork, as I said, is a designated healthy city. We have an action plan, and as part of our action plan from the 6 Ps of the Copenhagen Consensus under Planet, we have committed to the development and the connection with the Sustainable Development Goals to greening in our city. And green spaces, as you can see there, fits in very nicely under Planet. So we've got the WHO behind us, we've got Lancet Commission, and I suppose rooms full of evidence and theory to support the approach. And where we feel we fit is in the implementation side of climate action. So I'm going to just very briefly give you a kind of a whistle-stop tour of some of the work that we've been doing in Cork. And I suppose this originated Green Spaces for Health. We wanted to bring health into the whole sphere of greening and environment. Now, this is approximately 6 or 7 years ago we came together, and we felt that there was great opportunity, because there was natural partnerships in Cork, that we could start working in this way. So the very first thing that we did is we asked, could we take over a patch of grass basically on the side of a road in the South Parish, which is a highly urban space with very little green space available to the local community. But this grass patch, which is next, as you can see, a car park, we felt was an opportunity to show how you can transform a space into a more public and community-based space. So during the Lifelong Learning Festival in, I think it was 2017, we invited people to come along and to help us transform that grassy patch into a food forest. And as you can see there from the picture, a huge amount of people turned up out of curiosity, probably more than anything, but also because they had an interest in this movement. So a food forest was planted, and this was our first, I suppose, engagement with linking with Cork City Council, being handed a public green space and being allowed, I suppose, to do what we wanted with it. So the idea of this food forest is that there's food growing there, there's fruit trees, there's chives, there's borage, there's a whole range of food growing away there. It's next to an exceptionally busy public road, so it's very visible. And people are invited to maintain it and also to take the food from it. Then we were really lucky in that we recruited a fantastic coordinator, Maria Young, who coordinates the Green Spaces for Health for us. And we got this funding, it's part-time funding, and it's from the Healthy Ireland Fund. So Maria is contracted to do this work. And what I would say to you is, this has been the key in terms of the success of the work that we're doing in Cork. She has a fantastic way of engaging with the community. She is doing what I would call old style community development, in that she's on the ground, she's out in the community, she's knocking on doors, and she's supporting in any way possible the individuals that she meets. It is absolutely community empowerment at its core, and she's building community through the greening that's going on. So just to give you a flavour of the fantastic array of work that she's doing. So when Maria joined us, the food forest was in place. And when we had the food forest in place, it kind of fell flat in that it was, okay, what are we going to do next? And how are we going to take this forward? Because we're all very busy people. And that's where we managed to secure the funding for her post. Across the road from the food forest is this park that's kind of hidden, in fact, is completely hidden from the city. It's enclosed by houses, and it was subject to a lot of antisocial behaviour. And Maria and myself took a walk there one day with the community guard, and she was transfixed by it. She thought this was the ideal spot to start her work. So this park had been very subject to neglect. The gateway into the park from the main street was locked because there was a fear by local residents of people coming into this area. And what Maria did was she basically, through a community empowerment process, knocked on the doors of every house in that estate and introduced herself, and gently, I suppose, engaged with people in a way that they wanted to engage, not in a forceful way, not in a we're going to do this to your community way, but in a really positive, empowering model of saying, look, there's some green space here. This is a public park. How would you like to transform it? How would you like it to develop? And what has evolved is, I suppose, and it's, you know, it's the subject that I could do a full lecture on, and Maria would do a much better job on. But after, you know, 2 or 3 years, basically that park has become a test bed for a permaculture approach to greening in an urban context, and that's very rare. And what the permaculture, from my understanding of it, is you're basically working with the ground and with the land the way it is. You're not digging, you're not interfering with it, but you're working with it as you find it. And they've transformed that park. They have taken ownership in terms of the maintenance of it. Cork City Council workers no longer have to maintain that. They come in occasionally to do a tiny piece of cutting. You can see there in the picture of the man on the grass, they don't use any petrol or diesel motorized machinery. He's cutting the grass there with a scythe, and they're embracing really, you know, the connection with nature that is climate friendly. And, you know, if you ever get the chance, we'd love to showcase it to you, but basically that park is now spray-free, pesticide-free. There's 400 tiny sapling trees being grown, as it's a nursery for trees to be planted across the city. There's a whole array of food, and trees have been planted there. And I suppose the great success that I love to celebrate is that during the restrictions, you know, the community got so involved during the pandemic restrictions that one person even had their wedding party in the park. So it was transformed basically from a space of absolute antisocial behaviour to one of magic, really, and engagement and involvement of the local community. So other work that has evolved in terms of empowering, I suppose that gave us confidence to move on and to start moving beyond. Now, that didn't happen overnight. The work in Park Owen was very concentrated for about 12 months, and it continues on a weekly basis now. But we started to look out beyond the city, beyond that park to the broader city. and some work evolved on a beehive development with the local community college, St. John's College. And again, it was about capacity building and building people's understanding, and a fantastic project emerged with students who built the beehive, with a beehive project in the county, where they supported people and members of the college to maintain and manage the beehive. And in the first year, there was 36 jars of honey came out of that beehive, which is highly unusual actually in 1 year. But it just showed the need for, I suppose, for a beehive and the ability of a beehive to thrive in an urban context. Work has evolved since then to, again, during restrictions, you can see there in the middle picture on the right, a green area in a residential estate where residents were again feeling confined and wanted to come together in a safe way during restrictions, but wanted to embrace their local green area. And so this is a housing estate where, again, a grassy patch of land that I suppose is in the ownership and maintenance of their residents' estate was transformed into a food forest. Likewise, Clashdove Garden on the left, that's 2 tons of soil that was planted or landed there. That's a community park that was transformed into a community garden. The bottom left picture is an international garden where we're working with migrants from direct provision centres, so asylum seekers, to develop a migrant garden with a piece of land that was donated by the church. And the bottom right is the Curraheen Community Garden, which is right next to a playground in Curraheen and Bishopstown that the Tidy Towns were managing. And again, this was accelerated and supported by Green Spaces. So a kind of a whistle-stop tour that I could talk forever about. There's a whole range of greening going on in each of these communities. And these are some of the images. Those are the shovels that were required. That polytunnel is in a community that we were told no polytunnel could survive, that it'll be burnt, it'll be destroyed, and it has yet to be burnt or destroyed. People have really taken ownership, and I've been at that polytunnel where people out walking in the park just come up and out of curiosity want to know what's going on and are invited in and encouraged to attend, you know, on the Friday morning meetups. So there's 16 raised beds there. It's incredible. We also had to adapt to COVID, and we developed a tree trail for families to engage with trees in local parks that were very underutilized. And there was a Tai Chi class offered in that park, and that's place that was so subject to antisocial behavior over a number of weeks. Also, parklets were developed in the city, and basically replacing car spaces with these lovely seated areas. And the bottom right there is one that we took over outside. So there's 12 now across the city. There was one piloted on the left. You can see the test bed one. And the one on the right is the one that we've taken over and planted food outside the Key Co-op, which is a vegetarian supermarket and restaurant and cafe in the city centre. And the food that's in that parklet, which we get very precious about when we see people sitting on it, gets transformed into the cafe as well. This is just...
Going to have to close you up very soon, Denise. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to move on very quickly and just say that there's a whole programme of activities on greening, and we have got an online Greening Our Cities webinar as well. This is just something, 2 slides that I'll very quickly summarise. What I would say in terms of the challenges that we have encountered and that maybe Belfast can learn from. What we really feel strongly about is that working in silos and professional boundaries hold us back. So I would encourage everybody to work in a more open way, and what we call to be a honeybee, basically cross-pollinating ideas across silos and across professional boundaries, and trying to come together in a collaborative way, because the language of our expertise can be very alienating. Food is a fantastic mechanism of engaging community, empowering communities, working on health, and also working on climate action, because food growing builds community. And community food growing provides a supportive environment for available, affordable, and accessible healthy food. Be sure to value your volunteers and to calculate and, I suppose, demonstrate the input that they have. And finally, you know, how might, you know, Belfast take this forward? What I would suggest is that find some levers for developing this. The lever we used is the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as Cork as a Healthy City. Placemaking and livable cities, child-friendly cities, 15-minute cities, age-friendly cities, playful cities. All of these different levers can be used to move this forward and to gather partners for your endeavours. Focus on the co-benefits of climate action and public health, and there's many ways to achieve success. So have the courage to try different methods, seek out alliances and other actors in the space, and find a common language where you can work in your relationships and build community within your steering group, but also in the work that you're doing. And respond to the connections we now have with our local spaces, because people are crying out for this, communities are crying out for this kind of work. So what I would say is move beyond the individual approach to a more collective environmental approach and a connection back with the global perspective around climate change. Thank you, and I'm sorry I went over so much.
Thank you very much, and your enthusiasm just comes through, Denise. So a really, really interesting, marvellous presentation. And thank you for your insights and case studies and how to develop and support partnerships, because that seems to be the theme, how we make that connection and get partnerships. And I love the idea of the honeybee is a perfect analogy. Now we're going to try and do a Q&A for 5 minutes with our three presenters. If you'd all turn on your cameras, please, and we can take. So we're going to take some questions. I think Brenton's going to help us with that.
Hi, Howard, can you hear me there?
Can.
Wait, there's a few questions in the chat box, and I'll just sort of run through the gist of them rather than sort of going into them in great detail. I think first off, there's sort of a question about whether we know enough at this stage about what creating a greener city should be, or is there sort of need for more research on it? And some of the other questions sort of flow from that as well. There's sort of what lessons have been learned from projects like the Connswater Community Greenway, and how it interacted with the local community and how it was going along there. And I suppose I'll throw in a separate question at the same time, so rather than hold the conversation up. Where we saw change at the earlier part of the pandemic, where people were getting out more, people were traveling in their own community, and the roads weren't as congested. There's sort of been a bit of a rollback in that as people maybe go back to the office or sort of roll back to different ways. You know, do you think the behavioural change that we need can be recaptured to help us along with that?
Maybe that question, Mark, you could take forward initially.
Okay, yeah, I think you're right. During the pandemic, we were also surprised and happy to see the roads empty and our parks busier. That has gone back more to the norm. I notice it myself. I go into the office once a week. I take the train, but I noticed the roads are busier again. I think the big difficulty we had there is a sense of looking out for yourself primarily, and because there is this a fear of the virus naturally, so people haven't wanted to take public transport. People haven't wanted to be in places where, especially, so it's almost like a retrenchment into individual, looking after yourself and your own immediate family and not thinking about the greater thing. I think we have missed the trick, but I think the long-term understanding and appreciation of our green environment is probably good, and that will stick. I think we still have to go an awful long way to wean ourselves off the car, and that's one of the biggest challenges.
And it's probably going to be Big Brother in some way, Mark. It's going to have to come through some major policy changes. We
need carrots and sticks. We need a lot of very strong sticks. I mean, it's no longer appropriate to drive into the city centre and park for a couple of hours for a couple of quid. I mean, that's just not right. So.
Aaron and Denise, do you want to pick up some of the other questions that Brendan went through there?
Yeah, sorry, Aranvir, you go ahead.
I can just pick up the question about I think there's a question about evidence base and whether we have enough evidence to justify action. And I think the WHO have a strong body of evidence that draws out those links between greening, health and inequalities on a principled level. And we have local evidence that's being developed to support local action. And so, for example, Queen's University Belfast has their Groundswell project, And what we also find is that the evidence linking the indirect benefits to health and well-being from greening, for example, like addressing climate change or air pollution, is growing, and the WHO recognize the importance of nature as part of that conversation. But from my perspective, there's enough evidence to justify actions today. But it's a case of monitoring those benefits and really trying to understand what works best where, and that's where the focus of evidence should be, which is trying and then trying to measure the benefits of that, rather than not trying at all.
Thank you, Aaron. And Denise, you were going to come through there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I suppose, even though my biog there can be depressing when you say I've had 20 years of working in health promotion, what I've seen across the board is that these changes are incremental and they're slow, and if they're meaningful, you know, that's generally how things happen. Like when we started the Cork Food Policy Council in Cork, very few people were connecting the food system with climate change, and food sustainability wasn't as topical as it is now. So people are, the shift is happening. It's not happening fast enough for most of our liking, you know, for the people who've been occupying this space for a while. But the shift is happening, and while I agree, cars are a big issue. Sometimes it's the community building and the community empowerment side of things that can help the shift to happen faster. So that's what we're seeing. I mean, I didn't get the chance there because I was flying through my presentation, but what we've noticed is that this grassroots movement is shifting public policy here locally. There is a shift now in providing green spaces for food growing. You know, we have a horrendous experience of this war now in Ukraine, where food sustainability is becoming an issue and a topic of conversation. And it's horrendous that it's taken this for it to start to happen, but there's things starting to nudge us in this direction. And I think if you're up and running and ready to run with it, when the change comes, it comes faster then. So I wouldn't be disillusioned by the fact that people are going back to old habits. I'd be sustaining the energy and the efforts towards the right direction, and eventually the policy and the funding and the movement will come with you, and then you're ready to run with it, is all I like to say. Thank you.
Brent, was there any other questions you felt?
Yeah, there's a few here. There's a lot of questions going in now. We'll get through them all. There's one about, and I think this is probably for Denise, how people at a very local level, where you're maybe not a constituted group, where do you get that sort of support to start making those small changes or small projects that can make a change? And again, another follow on from that, someone sort of says, well, this is obviously about improving our city, which will potentially or hopefully have a positive effect on the desirability of the city, and that creates another problem of maybe sort of pricing people out of it as an urban issue. So how do you, that's maybe more of a planning issue, but potentially for Mark there. So maybe we could address those things.
That's a brilliant question. And that's where that was the gap we tried to fill, because that was exactly what was happening. There was groups out there, and Cork City Council, there was this kind of policy of we're going to make more green spaces available to communities, but the groups weren't able to connect in, or there was all these requirements around insurance and issues and all of that. So what we felt the gap was that an honest broker needed to be in there, in the in-between, between the community groups and the local authority. And that's what when we did that project in Park Owen, that was the effort. And on reflection, it was probably the best investment of our time. Maria worked extensively with the staff on the ground, not just the management in Cork City Council that will give us, say, the permission to work in the park, but also with the guys that were maintaining the space, to really talk about, you know, how are we maintaining these spaces? How are we making them accessible to people? You know, are we spraying them? Are we overcutting them? And building that relationship. And she built a rapport with them and built a trust that now it's come full circle, and that community groups ring City Council and say, can you give us green land, and can you make a space available for us to grow? And City Council come back to us and say, will you work with this group to get them established? So the role that we play is to link in. If one individual calls and says, I want to do something, we support that individual to develop a group and to develop a project. And of all the projects I outlined there, the one that probably is the most visually successful is the one that had a group in place. But the one that's most successful in terms of community development and really, you know, building from scratch is the one that just had a handful of people at the start. So it's about the worker being able to work with, whether it's an individual coming that wants to establish something or a group that's ready to go, being able to be dynamic enough to support that, because it's a great question. It was the gap that we saw when we started.
Maybe I'll pick up, well, there's one come through there in relation to landscape from Terence, and his question is about the issue about landscape being part of the discussion, and that the City Council really has to undertake landscape assessments. And in Mark's discussion, it was evident that there was, you know, there's lots of green in Belfast, but maybe in the wrong areas, and maybe not enough green within the city centre. So I think that his question is about to understand how important landscape is and green areas are in order in a city, and making a city green. And I suppose, I know these in small bases, but turning these underused spaces into kind of green lungs in parts of our city. Mark, have you anything to say about that?
I mean, yeah, all of that there is, like I said, it's not just the quantum of green spaces, it's actually the use and their function as well. And use, I mean, a public park is a public park, but it can also have many other functions, and also through animation and through events and through other types of uses, it can have a much greater impact than just being a public park. So we have to think, and that's some of that's, a lot of that isn't to do with planning, that's to do with operational matters and community groups. And you know, there are a number of gaps probably in thinking. As a planner, we tend to think of the regulation and do you get planning permission or do you not get planning permission? But there's so much else which is important, which affects the day-to-day value of green spaces. That it is important for the people to come together in some shape or form.
We're probably running out of time. I mean, really interesting questions here, and we're going to try and grab those questions and use them, but we really need to move on to our breakout discussions. So thank you again, panel, for your presentations and for taking those questions, and the quality and range of the questions is really interesting. So we're going to now go into the breakout sessions. All right, folks. So thank you again for your contribution to the breakout rooms. Again, really interesting discussions, and the reality is we could talk about this topic for much longer than we provided today, but it's great to see there's such interest. The three presenters, Aaron, Mark and Denise, will maybe give us some brief feedback from the discussions of the room. And we will start with Mark and Aaron. Sorry, you're going to do.
I can give feedback for room one, but then we'll ask for feedback from the two rapporteurs, which were Lizzie Pinkton and Linda for room three. So they'll just provide feedback.
Okay, sorry about
that. But I can start with feedback for room one. Which is really looking at the theme of building capacity across sectors to support greening and health in Belfast. And I think we had a really interesting discussion from a range of speakers or participants working across health, the environment and communities. And it really began with what struck us from the presentations, and there was a clear recognition that we could do much more with public spaces, and really trying to understand or make better the multifunctional use of these spaces, particularly in addressing flood risk here in Belfast. And I think there was what also struck participants was the lack of information on the users of these spaces, and really trying to address that as a knowledge gap moving forward in who uses what in Belfast and why. And then kind of trying to understand, is it a case of changing perceptions and how we move this agenda forward so that we can see green and blue infrastructure as multifunctional that deliver both indirect and direct benefits to health and well-being whilst also addressing those wider benefits such as biodiversity or climate change. The conversation then kind of went through a list of challenges, I think, in trying to bring stakeholders together, but really trying to build capacity of stakeholders at the same time. And participants mentioned trying to really provide support on the ground. And I think, Denise, that came in from your presentation, which was the role of Maria in providing that on the ground support to communities. And that really helps build capacities on the ground level. Really trying to maintain interest over the long term, and a recognition that these projects are for up to 30 years, and actually maintaining that community interest over time is a difficult challenge. And linked to that is funding, and this idea of multi-year funding, being able to support building capacity over the longer term. But then the real question was really trying to understand how to bring partners together. And we didn't really get onto a resolution of how we should, but there was a recognition of being able to develop shared agendas between what different partners are working on. And then we also finished with a really interesting conversation on the tensions between developing evidence, which addresses gap, and then delivering action, and trying to promote action, and then really trying to monitor the benefits rather than focusing on justifying actions through evidence. But then a recognition that it's not just evidence that we need, but also how we share that information with people so that it's meaningful to people in a way that they can actively use in their programs and projects. So that's all the feedback from our group. Mark, please feel free to add if I missed anything.
So breakout room 2, we were looking at what is needed to support joined up action for greening and health in Belfast. So we started off looking at what the barriers that we needed to overcome, and we were looking about who actually drives the thing forward, issues with insurances, who owns the land, and really getting buy-in from the local people to make it happen, and who gets their weight behind it, and how Belfast Healthy Cities themselves can help nudge this along. Again, the issue of the coordinator was brought up in our room in terms of being really critical, getting out there, knocking on the doors, really getting the buy-in from the people. We talked about who all should be involved in the process, and the like of Belfast City Council in terms of their land ownership and housing executive. But we also talked about small environmental NGOs like the Belfast Hills Partnership, like Lagan Regional Park. We looked at how we invite the wider group of people, the academics with environmental briefs, the community sector, and all these partners coming together and not limiting who comes, an open invitation for all. We discussed then the issue of people come from different backgrounds, they have different agendas and may not necessarily understand each other's perspectives, and how we can break down those barriers. And trying to get this more joint up thinking as to what we're at. The concept of placemaking and what people do there, we felt was quite key to helping people see each other's perspectives. And to conclude with, we started looking at the Cons Water programme and its successes, and how the on-the-ground perception has changed with real champions of the site, and how perhaps these champions could be shared and used to help build up other groups. But I think one of the key messages was that it takes time and it takes patience. But if anyone else in Group 2 wants to plump in, if I've missed anything, please do so.
Afternoon, everybody. Just the feedback from room 3. So we were looking at what's needed to empower communities to shape and use the green space. So some of the things that we felt were key that we learned this morning and just stuck in our heads were the requirement for that community buy-in and the engagement, really important. Everybody loved that deemed antisocial behaviour space became just turned around, that example in Cork. People also love the fact that you need the evidence, but do we have to wait? Should we develop that as we go along and include those local solutions? And then also having the green coordinator and that community development approach to green the city. So some of the key challenges that we referred to were the ownership that's needed, the leadership that's in the community, how do you harness that? Also the challenge of sometimes negative attitudes locally, or across the sectors in greening the space, and that fear of antisocial behaviour. So it is a real challenge. But some of the, hopefully, how could we address this? A few of the things that were mentioned were, well, how can we provide more education to all the sectors and how to practically green the space? So building that capacity and knowledge. Then also, how do we help? These are more questions probably than raising the issues than solutions. The challenge, the mindset of how do you value the community engagement? There are a lot of benefits with that, and so it's not tokenistic. And then lastly, really encouraging, how do we not work in silos? Because there's room for all of the sectors to come up with solutions. Thank you. Thank you, Aaron, Lizzie, and Linda. And apologies, I got your names wrong. I thought there were different people doing the groups. Anyway, thank you very much for.
Hi, everybody. I think we might have lost Carol, but if she comes back, I can drop out again. Thank you very much for all the co-facilitators or those that provided feedback on the workshop. And before I give some closing comments, I'd like to ask Sian to present her artistic report on the conference or on the session.
Hi, yeah, so I've done a little bit. A lot of it's in pencil, so you can't quite see that from this distance. But the idea is that I'm going to have kind of a background skyline of Belfast with some urban areas and then a bit of green, and then that's like the riverway coming in, and then like the bit from the WHO with all the P's. What was it? People, place, prosperity,
planet,
participation, peace. Those ones going to go across the top of the skyline, and then there's going to be some pathways coming down, and I've drawn up the little portraits. So there's be a couple of comments from the intro, and then about the different things that people said with the food forest and the park over by Denise at the bottom, and the beehive, and the little with some little bees going off and cross-pollinating and working, and some of the planning comments up by Mark. So I kind of haven't had time to kind of formulate how all the different things are going to fit together, and then in the middle about the bit about understanding what greening the city is. And so there's going to be some people like riding bikes and walking, and kind of a tree-lined street coming down, but then more, you know, maybe more of a green space at the bottom, which will have the comments from the breakout sessions. So at the bottom here, and then yeah, so it's still very much work in progress.
Okay, thank you very much. I understand a lot of it is in pencil, that also maybe isn't visible actually on Zoom as well, but thanks a lot for that. And the final one will be available on our website. But it leaves me just to make some closing comments, and I use Denise's words there. This has really been a whistle tour on greening the city, or greening for health. I think had we been meeting face to face, it could have been a full morning session. It's been really good to see such interest actually in people who were registered, and see the various groups of people who participated. So it ranges from health to organisations associated with, like the Belfast Hills Wildlife Trust, to public sector bodies and council. So we started off with Aaron providing the work that he's already done, and sincere thanks to all of the stakeholders who engaged initially as part of that process. And developing a new programme is always a challenge, and it's always a challenge to engage the right people at the right level, but I think that's been done very successfully. So thanks very much to all the stakeholders. We had a lovely presentation, and part of the focus is around inequalities actually in relation to greening for health. And we know that the use of, you know, even sometimes if you live beside green space, very often people from areas of deprivation don't often use them. So that's a big challenge in terms of going forward as well. But Mark clearly demonstrated the links and the traditional links between basically where public health started. Public health's foundation is in planning, and the significant changes that came in the early 21st century in terms of the relationship between planning, the relationship between how good sanitation, housing development, good infrastructure contributed significantly to both physical and mental health. And then we had our guest speaker, as I will call her, Denise, actually from Cork. And I thought the really interesting thing, Denise, was around the three categories of challenges, you know, conceptual, knowledge failure and implementation failure. And basically your focus has been on implementation failure. And I mean, congratulations, it's significant work that has been developed in Cork and been delivered in Cork over the last 5 to 6 years, you know, transforming spaces into food. And I think we all know that Maria, the coordinator, played a key role in that development at the very local level. And one of the other, I mean, we already have quite a number of projects or organisations working on greening issues across the city, but it's that working in silo, so that maybe we need to actually go beyond our individual remits and embrace the sort of the common good, for want of a better word. So the challenges are there. The lessons learned from Cork are really useful as well. The group work sessions were really good. Our session raised some really interesting issues, and it was also good to see some of the other UK healthy cities participate in this as well, and some from across WHO Europe. But it is very much a whistle-stop tour or a whistle tour of greening for health, and we will continue on this way. But sincere thanks to all of the speakers for giving up your time today, to all of the co-facilitators, and 2 of them are just joined us as Healthy Cities Board of Directors. So delighted for your contribution, Lizzie and Linda, to that. And I see another new board member, Ian Montgomery, has been on this session as well. So thanks very much to all of the stakeholders, to you who contributed. There has been an offer there from Denise if you want to contact her directly, but we will continue to keep that relationship in terms of the experience of Cork. But finally, sincere thanks to Carol Ramsey, our board member who chaired the session, and to Anne and Aaron. There went a huge amount of work into the background of this in terms of the preparation. It's a little bit of a challenge managing 60 to 7 people on Zoom, and to Brendan Scott, who supported the questions. But the report from this will go on the website as well. The evidence papers have been available for today and are already on our website. I'm right, Anne, in saying that, aren't I? I think they are. And the report from this, and anyone who wants to continue to be part of this, please do contact Aaron. We traditionally, our way of working has been to establish like a task and finish group or a working group on the issue to provide that guidance on taking the work forward in the city, and using very much that partnership collaboration, both from that the health perspective, but also from the greening the built environment or that natural environment sector. So thanks very much for all of you for attending, and we will be in contact with you, providing the support, the report, as well as the information being online. Okay, so bye.
Thank you.